Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the first panel at this year's Literary Translation Centre. It's really good to see so many of you here first thing in the morning on the first day, so thank you for coming along. My name's Kate Griffin, and I'm Associate Programme Director at Writer Centre Norwich. And I'm joined by Ruth Clarke, Vilis Kasims, and Sarah Braybrooke for this morning's panel. For the next hour, we'll be exploring how publishers choose which books to translate and how literary translators and cultural institutes can influence those choices. The word order in the title of the session is deliberate. We're going to start at the end of the process with a discussion about how publishers market and promote literature in translation to the readership. And from there, we'll explore the implications and lessons for pitching potential titles to publishers for translation. Later on, we'll also talk about how publishers, translators, and cultural institutes can work together, from pitching through editing to promotion. And there'll be time at the end for you to ask questions too. But now we'll start. Rather than just read out the bios of our panellists, I'd like to ask each of them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do. Ruth.
Hello, is this working? It is if I turn it on. Can you hear me? No?
Maybe we have to bring it closer.
Can you hear me if I...
Okay. Well, I think mine worked, so you can use mine. Yes. We just hand around.
Just pass it between us. Hello. I'm Ruth Clarke. I'm a translator from French, Spanish and Italian. And I'm part of the Starling Bureau, which is a collective of literary translators based in London. And we got together to find out basically what happens if translators do what they do individually, but together. And we discovered that that gives you a much stronger voice, a much bigger knowledge base, a much bigger contact base. And so it gives us a platform. We've got a website where we can recommend books that we would like to see translated in English. And we pitch books to publishers directly as well. You may have your microphone back.
Thanks. I'm Vilis Kasims. I'm with the Latvian Literature platform, and I'm one of the representatives of Latvian Literature abroad. So I'm one of the faces that publishers see when they meet somebody from Latvia to talk about literature. I'm also a translator myself in my day job. I do stuff from English, Russian, Catalan, but the main thing here is sort of like agenting, but not really. I will go into more detail later about that.
My name's Sarah Braybrooke. I'm the Managing Director at Scribe UK. We're an independent publisher. We publish about 60 books a year, and we're what I would call a generalist publisher. We don't have one genre we specialise in particularly. We do publish about 20-25% of our books in translation, but those will range from literary fiction right the way through to self-help or popular science.
Thank you. And as I said, we're going to start with promotion and the implications for pitching. So my first question is for Sarah Braybrooke. Could you talk us through Scribe UK's approach to marketing and promoting your translated titles with a few examples, please?
Yes. So the first thing to say is that promoting translated books is not, for us, it's not sort of separate from the promotion of any of our other books. Every book, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and because of the nature of the publisher, because we are generalists, we're not going to have, one brand of this is what a Scribe book looks like, and that's what a campaign for it will be. So our books in translation, our most successful books in translation, range all the way from Nightmare in Berlin by Hans Fallada, which was the follow-up to Alone in Berlin, literary fiction, historical, right the way through to our biggest bestseller, which is Gut by Julia Enders, a book about the intestine. So those books obviously are going to have really different approaches. What I would say is that with all books, what you're looking for when you start planning how you're going to promote them is essentially a hook. It's a way of getting media coverage for that book. And there are two ways that that's going to arise. Either really from within the book, whether that's because it's so important in a literary way that it's going to get review coverage, or because the author themselves is such a remarkable literary person, or whether it plugs into other external currents and trends and conversations that are going on. And I'll explain a bit about what I mean by that. So one example of a book we published successfully in translation recently is Walking in Berlin. This is a book by Franz Hessel. He was a contemporary and actually a good friend of Walter Benjamin. And it's basically a kind of flaneur's travelogue of walking through Berlin in the Weimar era. It's really historical. It's full of amazing detail of that really evocative time and place. And we published this. It came out, I think, about 18 months ago, something like that, in hardback, and it's been very successful. The way that we promoted it was, we sent it out for review, we, sent it to anyone we thought was going to be interested in covering this in the literary pages, but then my colleague who was doing this campaign made contact with the translator and said, look, she was based in Berlin. Do you know anyone in Berlin who's a travel guide, who's a walking tour guide, who might be interested in devising a tour based on this book, going around the sites that Hessel talks about? And the translator helpfully said yes, and they coordinated and they found someone who could do this. And then my colleague approached the Observer magazine and said, look, I've got a great idea. Why don't you do a travel piece where you're going to send someone to Berlin and they're going to do this tour of contemporary Berlin overlaid with Hessel's observations of the Weimar era. And they did just that, and it went really well. It came out beautifully. It was a really good piece. It was, for any travel editor, that's a great piece because, how many times can you cover the same locations? This is giving them a whole new angle on this destination. And obviously for us, it was great because people who don't really read the literary pages necessarily would be seeing that online and in the paper. And I mean, this book, I would just say as well, like in the way that we promote the book, we're always thinking about placement. So for this book, it's the design, it's the illustrative cover, it's the fact that we made it look like a gift. A lot of the time when you're promoting something, you can do marketing or publicity, but it does start from the placement of the book. And that's a conversation that happens in-house around the presentation of the book as much as, and the genre of the book as much as kind of the external stuff. One other quick example is sort of a different type of campaign, which was with a living author, much more focused on kind of getting into a certain type of conversation. And that's a book that we did called Familiar Things. It's a Korean novel by Wang Sakyong. He's a man who's had a fascinating life. He's in his 70s and he's an activist, someone who for many years had been involved in promoting dialogue between North and South Korea, promoting freedom of speech. And what was challenging about Wang Sakyong was that he had been published in English before, but not with huge success. And that can be really challenging because then you're going to people, you're going to the trade, you're saying, hey, we've got this great author. And they're like, yeah, well, the last book. So you're trying to kind of start a new conversation. And in that case, there were two currents that I really wanted to bring out in that campaign. And one of them was emphasizing the fact that Korean literature was having a moment and people were really interested. Post The Vegetarian, there was a renewed interest, and still is, I believe, in Korean fiction, which is fantastic. But just saying, oh, this is a Korean novel, well, that's not necessarily enough. The other thing was talking about him as a person and talking about the fact that he'd led this amazing life and that he really, really it's well timed that there was a proper in-depth profile of him in an English-speaking newspaper, and he should definitely be interviewed on, BBC World Service, BBC Radio 4. At the time that we did the campaign, I'd say I sort of semi-succeeded in getting that. Like, we got very good literary review coverage, much better than I would necessarily have expected. So people were definitely paying attention to the book, but they were still just kind of like in the literary pages. And since the book came out last year, it did do very well. And since it came out, I was approached by the World Service, who did an interview with him on Outlook. And I was also approached just like a few weeks ago by the Observer about doing an in-depth profile on him. And we're going to be doing this book's going to come out in B format paperback later this year. We're going to be doing his next novel next year. So in the terms of getting that coverage, it is also about building up over time. It's not necessarily all going to happen on publication, especially not with a foreign author who people haven't necessarily heard of. But we see it as part of the long game of establishing an important overseas writer in the English language.
Thank you. I just had a follow-up question about whether you're open to pitches from translators and cultural institutes, and what kind of information you look for in a pitch, and what advice you would offer, really.
Yeah, we're definitely open to being approached. In fact, I was literally at a book event last night, and someone just started sort of pitching me something in person that was quite interesting. And it was a book about an artist, and it had been previously translated and had come out, 100 years ago, but it had sort of languished. And they were sort of suggesting, well, maybe it's time to republish this, retranslate this. And what I said to her was, okay, this sounds interesting. Go away. Can you do some digging? Can you find out? Are there any significant anniversaries for this artist? Are there any major retrospectives for this artist? Are there any coinciding publications in the next few years? Because you have to think a few years ahead. It can't be something happening last month. Is there anything that could justify us revisiting this book? That's kind of the beginning of the conversation for that specific type of historical book. So thinking about those conversations, those currents that I was mentioning earlier, thinking around the book, I do have quite a lot of conversations with people, often translators, other people too, where they'll say, I found this book, it's amazing, I really think we should translate it, I really think we should publish it. And when you ask them more about it, has it already been translated? Well, that's one question, obviously. But, if it's new, you do also need to know quite a lot about where it is in the market. Like, is it something that has sold really well? That's obviously boringly a question any publisher will ask. Did it sell well in its home country? Stuff to do with the author. Is the author alive? Is the author speaking English? Are they an interesting person? Do they have a fascinating life story? I'd say, hearing about the kind of how wonderful the book is always really nice, but you need more. You need someone to sort of say to you, this is where this book sits in this place. We've noticed people are really talking about it. There's been loads of buzz about it. I've noticed, if you're based in a country, in a foreign country, that can be really helpful, because then you can also say, look, everyone's talking about this in my book club, or, there's really good word of mouth. So that's the stuff that, publishers can't really find out about that through Googling. I'd say bringing as much kind of intel to a pitch as you can, not just literary information, but information, commercial information, and kind of information about what you could see. Could you see this author having a brilliant interview in the Times? Like, are they just somebody who you think you could do that for? That's interesting for us.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask Ruth Clarke to talk us through the Starling Bureau's approach to pitching titles for translation, and also your response to Sarah's presentation and whether you're going to change the way you pitch as a result.
Can I just check whether this works in any way?
Well, I guess let's try it like that.
Okay. Right. First of all, I'm really happy to hear all the things that Sarah just said, because that's the information that translators have. All of those little extra bonus facts about where a book sits in the market and who the readership is. I think that's where a translator's real power lies. That's the special information that you have that a publisher wouldn't have otherwise, if they don't have someone who knows not only the language but also the market. So the main way that we are pitching books to publishers at the moment at the book fair is through this beautiful catalogue that we have produced, which is basically a portfolio of recommendations for books that we would like to see translated into English. We have, between the 5 of us in the collective, we cover 7 languages, and we've also worked with the wonderful Erika Lastovskaita from Lithuania and the Lithuanian Culture Institute to include some Lithuanian titles for the market focus, which as a collective is something to think about in terms of pitching, keeping your pitches current and relevant to what's happening on the publishing scene. Publishers are obviously looking for market-focused books at the moment, so we found someone who knows about market-focused books. The way that we come about a title is we basically do an internal pitch first. So we'll have a kind of show and tell session where everyone brings the books that they love, and we do a kind of elevator pitch or even a written pitch explaining pretty much what we would explain to a publisher to each other, and you can gauge from the reactions of the rest of the collective whether this is something that people are picking up your enthusiasm for or whether it's not necessarily going to work. And it usually just emerges that the one that you love and you can't quite describe properly, that's the one. If it's, it's fine, it's good, it ticks all the boxes, that's great. But if it's a little bit this and it's a little bit that and it's a little bit something else, and there's something special about the author and there's something special about why it's come out now or why we need to revisit it now, those are the things that really spark people's enthusiasm. Internally as well, we will include a lot of that information that would go to the publisher but wouldn't necessarily go into a pitch form like something as small as this, which would have a synopsis and some very factual, boring but necessary information, like the number of pages, which gives a publisher an idea of how much it's going to cost them. Practical considerations do need to go in there as well as this is a great book and this is why. I have more, but so we will, once we've chosen which books we'd like to include on the website or in the portfolio, we will produce essentially a one-page pitch, which is something that we can email to a publisher, and also preferably something like 3 lines, which you can use when you see a publisher at LBF or at an event and say, this is a great book and this is why, in a very, very, very short space of time or number of words, or on Twitter. So if one of those short pitches sparks an interest with a publisher, then we can send them much more information, get into a detailed email exchange with them where you get something that's much more like a reader's report, and also sample translations, because the essential thing about these is maybe the publisher can't read them. So you need a really strong sample and all of that extra information as well.
And what has the response from publishers been like so far?
Publishers are very intrigued. They've been really good in terms of reception to books that we've pitched them. I would say it's also really important to know, if you're a translator pitching books, know the publisher's catalogue, know where their interests lie, and tailor your pitch appropriately. So hopefully we've addressed the right books to the right people, and that's why we've got a positive response from them. Also, it's interesting that publishers contact us to ask either for a book in a specific language, like we'd really like to publish something from Brazil, what do you know? Or they will say, we have this idea of what our collection is going to look like, whichever next year or the year after the publishing year they're planning for. These are the kind of themes and ideas that the gaps that we're looking to fill, and then we can have a conversation about either something that we already know about, or maybe we'd know where to go and look. That's a good conversation as well. That's really interesting.
Thank you. And now I'm going to ask Vilis to talk about Latvian literature and how, as a cultural institute, they prepare pitches and promote Latvian authors to publishers. Vilis.
Yeah, thank you. First off, about what Sarah spoke, it's also quite interesting because as a cultural institution, obviously we have also some means to help with promotion. For instance, we have the access to Latvian community living abroad, either in here or in Germany, and obviously, if you just sell to Latvians, it won't pay back, more or less. But still, that's a beginning. And when you organize a tour, they would come to hear one of their favorite authors, whereas people in England or in Germany or in France, often they won't know where Latvia is. So that's part of the reason that we try to offer different kinds of things, like maybe doing it with a gig to get people curious about what's going on. So it wouldn't be just some random guy reading a bit from his latest novel that nobody knows about, but to have somebody either from here and author whom people know here to do kind of intro or something. So this is something to try to help with. And when you asked about pitching, how we do that, I think it's quite similar to what Ruth does with the Sterling Bureau. We have this small one-page elevator pitch kind of thing, where with all the factual information, with the basic synopsis, all that. And then we also have sample translations that it can be from 10 to 30 pages. Luckily, now we have the budget to be able to make these sample translations of quite a few works, because obviously a lot of publishers, or most of them, won't have anybody who reads Latvian who would be able to actually tell them that this is a good book. This is not just somebody trying to pitch you rubbish because this is what they have to pitch. So we have to work with publishers more long-term, because once they gain our trust, once they see that we're not just trying to shovel our stuff to them, and this is what goes back to what I said in the beginning, that me and my couple of colleagues that I work with, we're not really agents. So we work with the whole of Latvian literature, and we're not paid royalties of the rights that we sell, which is very important, because that way we can work more long-term, we can meet with publishers, we can get to know them, and they can learn to trust us, that we can tell them, sorry, now we don't have anything for you, but if something comes up, something comes out that we think is good, we'll get in touch with you. And this is very important. Some things that didn't work out in the beginning now have borne fruit.
Sarah, did you want to respond to anything that Ruth and Vilis have said so far?
No, maybe later.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'll move on to the next section, which is about how publishers, translators, and cultural institutes work together more generally. Sarah, could you talk us through the different ways in which you work with translators at Scribe UK? Editing and promotion are the first two areas that spring to mind, but maybe there are others.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, the two main forums, parts of the process that translators could be involved in, obviously editorially is the vast majority of our interaction with translators. And then in promotion, there are certain conversations we have with some translators. I'd say the first thing that might happen, the first contact that someone who is interested in translation or being a translator or is a translator, the first contact you might have with us might be doing readers' reports, which is where, we get sent a sample translation or a manuscript by someone like these two fine people, and then we want to commission an independent readers' report. We don't read that language in-house, and then we've got a database of people we might reach out to and say, could you read this Turkish book or this Latvian book or this book in German, and give us an independent view, basically a book report. So that's something that we do quite a lot of, and it's really interesting because you learn so much from reading those reports. You are looking for market information, you're looking for information about genre, you're looking for facts about the author, but you're also really looking for a subjective judgment. And the reality with publishing is that if you don't love it, then you can't really publish it well, in my opinion. So that's what we want. We want to read people loving a book genuinely, and that's going to inspire us to maybe take it to the next level. Which might be commissioning another reader's report, or it might be acquiring the book. So yeah, readers' reports, that's the first thing, and that feeds into the editorial and acquisitions process. Once we've taken the step of actually acquiring a book, then finding the right translator begins, and there are various ways that might happen. Sometimes one might have different sample translations from different translators and look at them and figure out based on that sort of which one seems right for the project. I think sometimes it's a bit more straightforward than that, so it really varies. And then once the book is actually in translation, the process will just really vary depending on the project, depending on the translator, depending on the editor. There are some translators we work with regularly, and it's just like, here's the manuscript, send them off, then they come back, and Bob's your uncle. It's great. And there are other projects that are just very complex and require a lot of thought and different stages. We've been working on a book which we're really excited about called The Eighth Life by Nino Haratishvili. This is a book that's by a woman who's originally from Georgia. She's living in Germany, writing in German. It's a 1,000-page novel, which we will be publishing next year in English. And that's a massive project. That's an undertaking that's been going on for years. And there's two translators who have been working on it in tandem, and they've been working carefully with two editors, and they have been. It's been going in stages. It wasn't a case of here's the manuscript, 1,000 pages, come back and next year and give us the whole thing. It was chapter by chapter, because the copy editing, of course, is also going to take a long time. We can't necessarily wait for the whole thing to be finished before we can start copy editing it. That's a sort of an unusual project. It will also depend a lot on the author. So if the author speaks very good English, they will probably want to be involved in the translation much more. So last year we had an amazing book by Elizabeth Osbrink, who's a Swedish writer. It's called 1947, When Now Begins. Very beautiful, poetic narrative non-fiction about 1947. And it was translated by Fiona Shaw. And, Elizabeth's mother's British. She speaks excellent, fluent English. So the conversations were, many layered. They weren't just kind of between the editor and the translator. Those are all different examples. Now, in terms of promotion, what I would say is that I'm often interested to talk to translators about promoting a book, and sometimes I definitely do reach out to them in the process of the campaign. But we also don't always reach out to them. So it's a case where if you were a translator who'd worked on a book and you had ideas, you had some information or suggestions, then actually to have you approaching us with those ideas is great, because we don't always assume that translators have that interest or that they have the time to do it. So examples of times when I've worked with translators on campaigns would be, for example, when we published Hans Fallada's last book, I was in touch with Alan Blunden, the translator, because The Guardian wanted to interview him for a news piece that they were doing about the book. And it was quite funny because I was delighted that The Guardian were doing a news piece just about the publication of the book. But Alan was a bit like, they're going to interview me? Okay. He hadn't been going around thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to get interviewed about this. And then when they ran the piece, there was a bit of a flurry online of people tweeting about it, and one or two people who I think were translation sort of activists, which is great, had because it was such a small quote from Alan, they were like, "Where's the translator? We should have more of the translator. Why isn't there more of the translator in this?" And I think that was a case where maybe the translator was sort of happy to help, but hadn't kind of envisaged themselves being part of the campaign in that sense. So it's always interesting because it's not a public-facing job most of the time. So to sort of talk about media campaigns for books might seem quite different to what I imagine a lot of translators spend their time thinking about. But some of the best things that can happen, I think, from a translator in terms of helping with book promotion probably has to do with being really attuned to the way the book has succeeded in its home country and noticing details that could be quite useful or relevant and that might be missed by the publisher in English. So, for example, if you have been translating a book and you are really abreast of all of the reviews coverage and all of the media coverage that book has received, or you know a lot about how it was promoted in its home country, you can sort of say, hey, there's this really interesting author profile that ran in, you know, the weekend supplement here, and you know, I think that there's an interesting personal story in this, and if you want, I can tell you more about the media coverage, and it just kind of helps to give us information. Agents do often do that, so we will often get agents sending us like all of the media clippings from the home country. But that's just one thing that occurs to me as being really useful, because we often, once the book's kind of in process, sometimes agents kind of don't really think of doing that, and it can be really useful. Yeah, I think that's the main ways.
Vilis, as a representative of Latvian literature, what's your relationship like with English language publishers, and at what stages of the publication process do you work together?
I think it's more or less throughout. Obviously, it depends on the publisher. Some publishers have quite a set procedure that they work with, and others, smaller ones in particular, they work with every book as it goes, and then we work much closer. So also we help publishers find translators sometimes. If publisher is doing a Baltic series, for instance, which has happened these years, they're looking they're looking for a book, so we send them samples, we tell them about different things, and then they say, okay, this book sounds good, send me a sample, and they say, yeah, well, I like the sample, but I'm not sure about the translation, and so we offer different translations of different things, and it also comes into what I said before about earning the trust. So we also in the beginning often we mention things that are important to know about the author or about the translator, because sometimes the best case scenario, everybody speaks English, everybody is very charismatic and able to perform and has a huge audience. Sometimes it doesn't always come together like that. So we have to make the publisher aware that this person might have issues handing in stuff on time, so you have to constantly remind him, but he's a very good translator otherwise, or these kind of things. Not that any of our translators are like that, but it's just in general, you know. So yeah, it's part of the building a relationship, especially in the beginning. And then, because we also offer grants to publishers to both produce the book, translate the book, and promote the book, we often have to help them make use of it, and we have to help the publishers realize what it entails, because especially if they haven't really worked that much with grants before, they're not really sure when do they get money, what do they have to do, how many contracts they have to have the paper trail everywhere in order to be able to account for the money received. So this is another thing that we do. And it's less with English publishers, but because now we have some books out in English, and then publisher from Albania, from Croatia might come to us and say, hey, we want to do this book. We read it in English. It sounds great. Do you have anybody translating for it to Croatian? And then, yeah, that's another thing that we do, that we try to get people that would help them, or sometimes also finding these readers, as I mentioned before, because you want the reader report. Even if it's even if you can read it in English, sometimes still you want to have reader report from another person. So yeah, those are the main things, and it really depends from publisher to publisher. Some publishers you have to be more, we try to be more hands-on, because they might have less experience working with translations, and it's different than working with a local author that can give him a call or pop by down the street and have a drink and talk about it. And it can be difficult sometimes if the author is 90 and not really traveling a lot. Still, we try to work out with publisher a way to promote the author, the book, the whole, to sell the idea of Latvian literature in general.
And I also noticed the badge you're wearing, I Am Introvert, which is part of Latvian Literature's promotional campaign. Could you kind of explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah, this actually started when we spoke with British Council here. We realized that people don't even have a stereotype about Latvia. It's basically a blank spot. And I know the French are complaining and Germans that, yeah, people in the UK, they have this stereotype about us and it's terrible, they only see this. And we're like, yeah, we don't even have that. Nobody knows who we are. It's somewhere, maybe near Russia, maybe near the Scandinavia, I don't know. So we came up with this, yeah, we're kind of reserved people, we're introverted, so let's do this, let's do this tongue-in-cheek thing. We think that will go over very well. And then Estonians got a bit upset because they see themselves as more introvert than us. So they're saying, no, this is not right, actually. This it's an interesting idea, but we don't agree with it. Yeah, but I think it has worked pretty well. People are engaging with it. They like the cartoons that we did. We have all this campaign. I think it's worked pretty well.
Thank you. Now I'll ask Ruth to talk about her experience with publishers, both as a member of the Starling Bureau and also as a translator in her own right.
Thank you. Picking up on what Sarah has said about translators bringing ideas to publishers about how to go about promotion and marketing and things like that. This is something that came up yesterday as well at the TA symposium. We all, publishers and translators, seem to really underestimate the resources that translators have and can bring to that stage of the process. So we might have press contacts that would be useful. We would have access to source language material like reviews and interviews that we could translate either to be used and placed in the media here or just as resources for you to produce something new. And translators sometimes are keen to get involved in promotion and sometimes like talking in public and sometimes don't necessarily like talking in public, but we'll do it anyway. So as speaking on behalf of 5 people, we have a range of experience of working in promotion, from working with big publishers who really have kind of not involved us at all in the marketing and the promotion stage of the process, through to excellent small publishers who really put the translator front and center of events and do a lot of translator naming in their press releases and things. And I know that Paul with Fitzcarraldo has been asked to do readings and presentations of his books, which I think is really nice. Even if you have the author there, I think it's nice to hear from the translator as well, because they bring a different angle. This is not talking about my experience, but I think an audience, and whether it be an audience at an event or an audience reading something in the media, I think there is an interest for not only hearing about the translation as product, but hearing about the translation as a process, and to discuss the translation process and the editing process, which I think people are increasingly interested in. That's a really good source of conversation about how you end up with the text that you get in the end. And I think I enjoy the editing process and I enjoy talking about editing. So I think that's something that we can do more of as well.
Thank you. Do any of you want to say anything else before I open up to questions from the floor?
I just wanted to sort of reiterate that one of the things that I personally find very fascinating about literary translation is that the sheer, it is the interface of cultural exchange and communication, and translators are some of the, and people doing the kind of work that you do, in agencies, they're the people who are allowing it to happen. It won't happen unless individuals kind of do bring things to the table, and obviously because of Brexit and the world we seem to be living in, I think at the moment there is, I personally feel very passionate about hearing about what is going on in other territories, in other countries, in other cultures, in other markets, and seeing how much of that we can bring to the UK and into the English language successfully. So I just wanted to reiterate that, I really think that literary translators have the potential to basically be spies, intercultural spies, who are going out and gathering information. And, some of the best ways of doing that aren't necessarily going to be particularly specialised. They are basically being consumers. So if we're in that country, going into bookshops, picking up books, get your hands on the books, sniff the books. What can you see piled up at the front of the bookshop? What can you see people talking about? What are people tweeting about? Like, look at what is going on and what you're just getting a feeling around, and kind of think in terms of how book buyers think. Because if book buyers are responding really well to a book in a country and it hasn't necessarily been picked up on, it might not even really have been picked up on by the media in that country, but if there's something going on, then that's what we're interested in. I think Guts by Julia Enders is a great example, because that was a book that, it came out of a young medical student who did a science presentation that went viral on Facebook, and it was a big success in Germany, but, we acquired it kind of before we really knew what we had our hands on. And I think that those are some of the projects that can be really exciting, where there's just something going on in one country and you want to see, can you make it happen in another country too? And the best way to do that is often not necessarily just going to be about the book. It is going to be about just getting that feeling of what people are excited about, and seeing if you can communicate that into an English language publishing house to start with, and then into the English language market and media.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there, but I'd like to now give you the chance to ask questions. We have a roving mic, so if anyone has any questions, do you want to put up your hand? Okay, we've got a couple at the front here. Could you also tell us who you are?
Okay, I'm Daniel Parsons, an indie author. As an indie author, it's quite difficult to work on quality control for translations, because you're obviously not working with a publisher that can do that for you. You mentioned the independent readers reports. Is there a reputable company that can set one of those up for you so you can check the quality of a translator?
Not that I'm aware of. The only way that we at Scribe, maybe larger houses have something more systematic. At Scribe, the way that we would sort of check someone's quality of their reader's report would just be by reading it and seeing if it was convincing to us. And in terms of checking the quality of a translation, once a book is translated into English, the type of sort of quality control that editors are exerting is on the English language version that they're looking at. So they're not looking at the original source language, I think. Is that relevant?
If you wanted to translate from English to another language, though, and you don't speak the other language,
I see.
Can you do it for that way?
I don't know anything about that, I'm sorry.
Right, okay.
Sorry, I don't think we can quite help with that, but next question.
Hi, my name's Joanna. I'm a translator of Polish, French, Norwegian and German into English. My question is quite a practical one as well. I was going to ask whether a publisher would expect a translator to already have the translation rights to a particular novel before they approach them with a synopsis or a book report, or whether that would then become part of the process.
No, we wouldn't expect the translator to hold the rights. We would expect the rights to be available in some form, I guess. So if it was a book that had already been if the rights had been bought and it had been translated, that would be a problem. But no, I mean, if you know what the status is and who has them, then that's what we need to know, I think. That's right, Ruth, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say the same. And I should have said that before. Before you start pitching a book to people, check that the rights are available for it, because just because the translation hasn't come out doesn't necessarily mean the rights are available. They may have been bought and they're being sat on somewhere in an office. So do check that the project that you want to do or the book that you're pitching is actually available for translation.
And also that includes dead authors, because sometimes it is a big hassle to get the rights sorted for somebody who's passed away, even if he passed away 50 years ago, because their their descendants might not be talking to each other, or these things happen. And we've had one or two cases where a very good book that had found a publisher, we weren't able to go on with it because the descendants didn't agree on what to do with the book. Alas, you can get in touch with the cultural organization of Poland or Germany, and they would be able to tell you in these cases. Otherwise, it's the original publisher of the book that would know about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Abigail Graham. I translate commercial texts and poetry from French, German and Dutch into English. And I was interested to hear Ruth, what you were saying about your communications with publishers. And I wonder if you have a favourite book that you'd like to tell us about, your experiences with one particular text.
A bit of live pitching going on.
Yeah, a book that I've worked on already, or a book that I want to pitch. Oh gosh, favorites. Favorites are always difficult. It's like picking your favorite child. You really shouldn't do that. As I said before, I really enjoy the editing process, and I think if you have a good editor and a good conversation, that's my favorite part. When it becomes a more collaborative process and you see the thing taking shape and taking a shape that you couldn't quite get it into by yourself, and when it really comes alive at the end, that's my favorite bit of any book, regardless of which one. No, hopefully it's always the last one.
It's a very diplomatic answer for all your children. Another question.
My name's Rachel Robertson. I'm a French to English translator. I just wondered how about the process if a translator comes to a publisher with a book and the publisher likes the book but perhaps isn't so keen on the translator. How does that work?
Sorry, I didn't actually catch the last bit.
Sorry. I asked if the publisher is keen on the book but isn't so keen on the translator. How does that work? What happens in that case?
Yes, I can understand that question. That's obviously a sensitive one, isn't it? Look, I think there are cases where someone would notify us about a book and pitch it to us, and we would go ahead and commission it, and they would translate it. And in an ideal world, that probably is what would happen every time. But the editorial process is kind of separate in a way from the actual acquisition of a book. So making a case for acquiring a book and is one set of decisions that are made in one way, and then editing a book in any language is kind of a separate set of skills and decisions. And so I think there's a bit of separation of church and state, at least for us anyway, that we wouldn't assume that one follows the other. You've acquired a book because a certain person told you about it, therefore the editorial process is going to revolve around having that person translate it. It would just be really dependent on whether they, because of their translation experience, profile, skill set, and simply the way that they write, were the right person for the project as compared to other translators who we may otherwise have worked with. So I don't think translation contests, I think they're sometimes called, where is that what they're called? Where you sort of get people to do, 5 people translate one page, and then you pick the style that seems right for the book. Those are carried out sometimes. They're not always done at Scribe, but I know that they have been done on occasion. And I mean, it just seems to me that there are going to be some cases where that is the right way to pay the necessary respect to the text, in a sense, without in any way wanting to diminish the importance of having translators pitching us things and listening to them and taking them really seriously.
Go ahead if you want to respond to it.
Well, one thing that I might add is that generally I don't know if it's very common that translation or translator is really somebody you can't work with at all, because there's a vetting process until then usually, and people get filtered out more or less. But sometimes if the translator and the publisher aren't a good fit necessarily, which can happen even if the translator is good, what happens generally is that the next translation they're going to pick up, they're going to use a different translator, and that's generally the worst case scenario. So there's no need to be afraid to pitch stuff and go on with it.
Yeah, I think unfortunately as a translator pitching books, that's just the risk that you have to take. And if you're doing a sample translation, just make sure it is as good as it can be. And that's the best way to make your strongest case for being the translator who does it in the end. But also, I mean, there might be a question of scheduling or all kinds of practicalities that mean someone else ends up doing it. And yeah, just try and be happy that the book makes it through to English at all, even if it's not with you sort of being part of the birthing process. Just be happy that this thing is born.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm an author and I've been translated into a handful of languages, but my question is more as a reader. How do you explain that there's such a low percentage of foreign literature that's translated into English? The figure I hear is 3%, but I may be wrong with that. But where is the blockage? Is it that the readers are frightened by foreign-sounding surnames, or is it that the publishers have more of a duty to their local authors? Why is the percentage so low?
That's actually a question for a whole other panel discussion, I think. We've only got a few minutes left. Do you have a quick response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would respond to that a little bit less from the point of view of book promotion and a little bit more from the point of view of right selling, which I sometimes do. And the reality is that if you're sitting opposite a publisher from another country and you're pitching them your book, they need a really good reason to buy it, because they're not just publishing it as it stands. They have to pay for it to be translated, and then you have all of the risks that are incurred when you're moving between cultures, and there might be things that don't quite land in the same way. A lot of the time when I talk to people about certain of our books, I know that they say, yeah, it sounds great, but we have this in our country already. We already have a book on this subject by a local author, or this market's really crowded locally. So those are generic reasons why books fail to be translated. I think you're probably right that there are some specific reasons why English as a language has a very low rate of books being translated into it, and I think, like probably everyone here, like I feel really passionate about changing that. But it's there's lots of factors, cultural factors about English, the English language, and then simply the mechanics of selling rights between languages, which always comes with certain hoops one must jump through before you can get anywhere.
Are there any more questions? One at the back, I think.
Hi, I'm Jake Schneider. I'm a translator from the German and also a editor of a literary magazine in Berlin called Sand. So you said that when people cold pitch, you've never heard of this translator before, they approach you, they have a book in mind, and then they may or may not, if a publisher acquires it, they may or may not be the person who actually ends up translating it. And then there are these other translators waiting in the wings. And I was wondering where those other translators come from. Are these people who have approached the publisher in the past and that's how they got a previous job and that's why this publisher knows about them? Or are they just people with name recognition? Or like, how does that stable of translators who's worked with a particular publisher kind of develop?
I think that's be interesting to hear all three of your perspectives on that one.
Oh, yeah, I'll just start because I have this now in my mind. As a cultural institution, one of the things that we do try to do a lot is to promote translators, especially from Latvian, because it's such a small language and there are not many people translating fluently from Latvian to even English, French, Spanish, even the big languages. So we really try very hard to find these people, and often it happens that there's been a translator that just hasn't turned up, that we just don't know about him or her. So the first thing for us is get in touch with the cultural institution, try to get smaller translations published in magazines and stuff, and sometimes it just happens that you turn up at the door of the publisher, which actually, because I live in Spain now, I know a Spanish publisher that found their translator from German that way. Literally, there was a girl that showed up at the door of the publishing house and said, "Hey, I'm a translator from German. This is my CV. These are my sample translations." And they want to do something from German, and they thought, well, the translations look good. Yeah, do you want to do it? And that's just one way. It's not always the best way, but yeah, just try to get your name out there. That's all that you can do in the beginning, especially. And one last thing that I remembered that already Ruth mentioned. It's very important when you pitch books to find the right publisher for the book that you have done the sample translation for. If the publisher doesn't do classics, there's no point in offering them a classic because they just won't look at it and they just won't think of you when they're thinking of somebody to translate from German. That's one of the bigger problems I've found over the years of what translators have done wrong. For me as a translator, in the beginning, how I found book translations was literally sending samples to publishers I knew. And even if I wouldn't be doing the book that I'd done the sample for, they might be offering something else to me. And that's just how I started.
Thank you. Ruth, have you doorstopped any publishers recently?
Well, yesterday. I did. Yesterday, someone happened to say, "I really like Italy. I really like politics, and I'm really interested in things that are set in the past." And I just went, if I could just casually draw your attention to this. It wasn't very subtle, but it nearly worked. But in answer to the question, where do these translators come from, and how do you become one of those translators? Obviously, publishers have a group of translators that they already work with, because translations are being produced all the time. So they have names that they know, people with experience, and people who are a trusted person to work with, and they know those translators work well at all or very well. So as a new translator, you need to find that space to get your work seen. So translating things for journals, translating short stories, getting your name known as much as you can, and pitching is a good way to do that, because it gives people an idea that you know what you're talking about, you know the market, you know, hopefully people think you have good taste, and that if they've seen that you have good taste and that you can do a good sample translation, then hopefully at some point someone will take a chance and give you a full novel-length translation to do. And usually that just, you don't know where that's going to come from. It will turn up, hopefully. It might not be one of the things that you're pitching. And the big news for first-time translators is the TA First Translation Prize, which is doing great things to promote the idea that editors should take a chance on first-time translators. So if you can kind of get yourself to a level that someone's willing to take a chance on you, then you're just kind of waiting for your big break, really.
And there's also the Emerging Translators Mentorship Scheme that Writer Centre Norwich runs that has been quite a good way for emerging translators to get known by publishers. But let's finish with Sarah. How do you find your translators?
I mean, it really depends. So our publishers and editors will each of them have people that they have worked with already, which isn't very helpful to say, but it's true. We might hear about someone through them. They might recommend someone if we approach them for a project. They say, "Look, my schedule's full, but here are some other people I know who you might want to contact." That's one way it might happen, I suppose. We would just look at what else was out there, and if one of us had read a book that was very well translated from a language, we'd probably make a note of the translator's name. There are lots of different organisations and networks. In terms of the only thing that we sort of maintain in-house that comes to mind is that we have the database I mentioned of people we ask for readers' reports, and I would really say that I think that's a very good sort of entry level if you want to start building contacts with publishers, to approach them and say, FYI, I read this language, I would love to write readers' reports for you if you have anything that you want me to report on in this language. And that's just a good way of a low commitment way to start building relationship, because something like that might just be a one-off that you do, and if they like that report, it's useful to them, or if you've suggested a book to report on and it's really fits their list quite well, even if nothing comes of that particular approach, then you've got a way of initiating contact. Also, you are welcome, if you would like, to come to the Scribe stand, which is at 6F51, and I will give you a Scribe tote bag and some Scribe books. So you can come and say hello to me later if you want. So you can do the door-stopping thing a little. Book fairs are a good place to do it. I'm not sure I would really recommend anyone turns up at our office. Our office is in a basement, and there's not much room, so don't do that to us. But come and say hi later if you like.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time now, but will you please join me in thanking Sarah, Vilis and Ruth?